Hello and welcome to our 2020 Annual Healthcare Conference. I'm Amber Fennell, partner and co-founder of Consilium Strategic Communications, and alongside our sponsors Citi, Cooley, Stiefel and Intrado, I'm delighted to open our digital conference this year. Whilst we're saddened to not be with you in person, I am so pleased to see so many of you online today. We've worked really hard to bring you a programme that we hope will give you a chance to reflect on everything that's happened over the past year and think about things for the future. 2020 will most likely go down as the most memorable year of all our lifetimes. The healthcare industry has had to adapt, accelerate and innovate in so many ways, to not only respond to the COVID crisis, but also to ensure that innovative treatments, technologies and diagnostics continue to be developed apace despite all the disruption and challenges of this year. Our sector has never been so more vital. Our sector has never been so strong. And I am proud to have seen, alongside the challenges of this year, so much success and achievement that all the innovative science and technology that has been fast-tracked to meet the challenges of COVID, or the slew of new innovations receiving backing from investors all over the world. And I'm delighted to have with us today such a strong range of speakers from across the industry to talk about these topics. But just before we start proceedings, we'd like to play a short video from us and our sponsors.
Hi everybody, I'm Mary Jane Elliott, Managing Partner of Consilium Strategic Communications and proudly set up the business back in 2013. Welcome everybody to our annual healthcare conference. I'm pleased to say this event has grown significantly since we launched Consilium 8 years ago, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. I'd particularly like to thank everyone on the conference team at Consilium for pulling this virtual event together for all of us. And of course, thank you to our sponsors Cooley, Stiefel and Citi Depository Receipt Services. Finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to say how proud I am of Consilium's resilience and our staff's exceptional work, despite the extraordinary challenging environment that we and our clients are all currently operating in, given COVID-19. Our business has gone from strength to strength. The organisation is still rapidly growing on both sides of the pond. And as always, I thank our staff and our global clients for their constant support. And I feel proud to be operating in the healthcare sector where Consilium's advisory work is in such great demand.
Hi, I'm Amber Fennell, partner and co-founder of Consilium Strategic Communications, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today. Our annual healthcare conference has always been about providing a forum for the industry to discuss and debate the key issues facing our sector. It's critical in our busy lives to step back and take stock and hear about other people's experiences, but even more so during this COVID crisis, where the vast majority of us are working from home and away from the normal one-to-one interaction that helps us drive innovation and development in our sector.
Sean Ruby, EMEA Sales Head, Citi Depository Receipt Services. I always come away from the conference armed with fresh ideas and perspectives. I very much look forward to the fireside chat this year. Citi DRs is delighted to be partnering with Consilium, Cooley and Stiefel for this event. It is more important than ever to be taking stock and thinking about how we should approach the many unknowns of 2021.
So hello everyone, my name is Nicola Maguire. I'm a partner at Cooley in London in their life sciences team. I just wanted to take a few moments to welcome you all to Consilium's healthcare conference. It's great to be sponsoring the event again, and I'm really delighted that it's going ahead despite COVID. I know it's always a high quality event. It's certainly been a really unexpected year with lots of challenges that I don't think any of us really expected at the beginning of the year. But I think it's a good moment for us to take stock and reflect on how things have gone and also work out how we're going to meet the challenges that there will be in 2021.
Hello, My name's Nick Moore. I'm a Managing Director in the Healthcare Investment Banking team based at Stifel in London. It would be great to be welcoming you face to face for this event this year, but I think one of the big advantages of transitioning into the virtual environment is it allows an even broader range of people to participate internationally from centres outside London and the UK. A pandemic on this scale has certainly given cause for governments, the healthcare industry and the city to reassess our modus operandi. It's been a time of rapid innovation and impressive adaptability, so I'm really looking forward to the main panel of the day on the impact of COVID-19 on the future of healthcare.
Thank you. So to our programme, and we're honoured to have with us some of the leading lights of our business and hear how they've met the challenges of 2020 and what we can learn from those experiences. Josh Schimmer, Biotech Equity Research Analyst at Evercore ISI, will lead our first panel alongside Hugo Fry, Managing Director of Sanofi UK, George Goldsmith, Chairman, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of mental healthcare company Compass Pathways, Rachel Mears, Partner at Jato Capital, Lyndon Thompson, Lead Manager of AXA Framlington's Biotech Fund, Anne E. White, Senior Vice President of Eli Lilly and President of Lilly Oncology, and Professor Tom Wilkinson, Professor of Respiratory Medicine, University of Southampton, co-founder of MyM Health and the Trial Chief Investigator of Synergen's COVID-19 treatment SNG-001. Many thanks to all our panellists for being with us today. And also, if you'd like to ask a question, please do so using the Q&A tab on the platform. Also, do follow up on social media with hashtag CSE Health 2020. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Amber, and thanks to Consilium for inviting me to moderate this panel. We'll spend about an hour talking about how COVID is impacting various aspects of the biopharma industry, think about what the future might look like. As Amber mentioned, there's a question box which you can write questions into. I'll do my best to keep an eye on those, and if I miss them because I'm technologically inept, I apologize for that in advance. We do have a great group of panelists representing the gamut of biopharma innovation and care delivery and lots to cover. And I thought we'd jump right in and focus on operations and get a sense of how some of the businesses have evolved over the past year. So starting with Hugo Fry, as a reminder, Hugo's Managing Director of Sanofi UK, and Anne White, SVP of Eli Lilly and President of Lilly Oncology. So we're about 8 or 9 months into the global pandemic. Maybe you can tell us about some of the fastest elements of your businesses to recover and what have been the slowest. Hugo, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think it's worth highlighting one bit that didn't need to recover because it was remarkably robust during the pandemic, and that's our overall supply chain. And I think that even surprised us, and we were delighted about it. You know, factories. Our factories all around the world, even at the height of the pandemic, for example, in Italy, were running at worst 95%, and for most of the time 100%. And we were able, albeit with more difficulty, able to get enough trucks of cold chain and everything to make sure everything from vaccines to insulins to ultra-orphan vials were continued to get to the patients that mattered around the world. So I think that robustness gave us a lot of confidence. I think there's some things though that have been very slow, and notably in the UK actually, but around the world you see different areas. But there was a dip in core services provided for healthcare. Things like oncology diagnosis, routine surgery, other initiations and diagnostics of immunotherapies. And they dipped way down. And they have been quite difficult to recover. And they've been slower to recover in the UK than other countries. Notably, for example, maybe I'll let Anne talk about oncology, so I'll talk about routine surgery. Routine surgery has still not come anywhere near back to there. So that means there's a load of people out there still suffering from hip problems, knee problems, and other issues like that. And I would take that just as a surrogate for many other issues and treatments and procedures that people aren't getting. And we'd have to think harder about how we can get back to normal levels of non-COVID related illnesses. And I think it really does get healthcare systems thinking.
Hugo, on your point about supply chains, I know at the very beginning it felt like supply chains might be rather tenuous, ranging from everything from toilet paper to staple goods. You said that you didn't see much disruption to the Sanofi UK operations. Was this the ultimate test of that, or are there lessons here for preparedness should we have greater strains on supply chain dynamics that you're going to be looking into post COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always the danger, where you can conflate things. So in a supply chain, there's always issues in manufacturing or something else unrelated to it. But one of the things we are looking into is API supply, much of which today for many companies comes from India or China. And we're trying to build a more robust API supply in Europe. So actually, as a company, what we're doing is we've identified a number of our factories that do manufacture active principle to try and make Europe more self-sufficient. And we're going to spin that out as a separate company so that it can supply more of the industry and therefore hopefully secure that back end of the supply chain and not be too reliant on other places around the world.
Great. That's an important takeaway. And maybe we can turn to you and tell us a little bit about Lilly Oncology and were there any pieces of the business that weren't in place that have needed to be put in place over the past year?
Well, thanks, and it's great to be with everyone today. And there was quite a bit of response that had to be done in response to COVID, and probably not in the areas that I had thought. So really, one thing we had to do is overnight, we moved to have 80% of our workforce work from home. So for Lilly, that's about 30,000 people suddenly working from home. And what I'm proud of is we were very decisive and did that really when there were only a handful of cases in the US at that time. But seeing what was on the horizon, made that decision quickly. But I would have forecasted that we would have had significant IT challenges. And in fact, thanks to investment over the years, that was not the issue. That was seamless with our organization. What we found most challenging was actually the infrastructure in our healthcare system to respond to COVID and not having that in place. And so one thing that we needed to do actually that I was also quite proud of is Lilly created the first drive-through testing that we had in the state of Indiana, which is where our headquarters is. And I think one of the first in the US. It was modeled after South Korea. And we provided COVID testing, not just for our employees, but for the entire community, state of Indiana. People could come through. And at one point in the early days, we were testing thousands of people per day. But we knew if we could get that testing in place, we could get at least our manufacturing employees back onto the lines, to Hugo's point, to make sure that we didn't interrupt the supply chain. We make insulins and cancer medicines and other things that people can't do without, especially in the time of COVID. So we needed to make sure that we could get our manufacturing sites up and running. And so COVID testing was key. But then also if we wanted to stop the COVID in Indiana, that was something that we had to do. And then also we had never made a COVID antibody in the past. We are an antibody company, so that wasn't too daunting. But moving from essentially a disease to an antibody that we now have approved in the U.S., bamlanivimab, and hopefully approved globally in the near term, that was a very, very significant investment for our company and new ways of working that we'd never done before. And it was pretty impressive. We even created a mobile pharmacy to go around to sites because we were using sites that we'd never used before. And as you know, antibodies are complex to prepare. So it was a very motivational time in what we're able to do, but also obviously we have a lot more to do if we're going to emerge from this pandemic. But it was impressive to see what we could use that we already had, but we had to create quickly at the same time.
And then Hugo mentioned the slow to recover services aspect. What have you seen in oncology, and what, if anything, can Lilly do to support some kind of return to normal care patterns?
Yeah, if you ask me what my greatest concern is in the world of cancer, it is the fact, as Hugo said, that we saw diagnosis, testing, procedures to diagnose cancer drop dramatically, particularly in the middle of this year, and they're still not back up to where they need to be. And in a recent study in JCO, there was actually, it showed that these short-term interruptions are going to have long-term health implications. And our mantra that we walked around the halls of Lilly is that cancer doesn't stop, and so neither can we. We need to keep pushing forward, producing new medicines. Now, there's encouraging signs that testing and other things are starting to recover, but not at the rate that we need to. So that's the message that our field representatives and others are out there saying, is that, cancer is still a concern. We need to make sure that patients are diagnosed and treated, even in light of COVID.
How have the reps been managing through all of this and detailing and raising awareness, particularly?
That's been probably one of the biggest challenges. Obviously, we want to make sure that our employees are safe, and obviously cancer patients are a high-risk category, and so we had to be very thoughtful of that. So we actually switched. We have not had reps in the field in most countries throughout this entire pandemic. We only recently started introducing them back in the US just in the last few weeks, and probably adjusting that even back a little bit from where we were. So what we had to do is shift to digital interactions and virtual interactions. And again, thanks to a strong IT front here at Lilly, that was not a hard shift to do. So the majority of our interactions, probably 80% at this point globally, are virtual and digital and not in person. But the good news, there are opportunities when you have a situation like this, a challenge like this, and that was one of them, is that response to accelerate digital and virtual interactions. And my anticipation is that coming out of this pandemic, we will see that more physicians are more willing to do that, even in the future, beyond this experience, because they've gotten that exposure to it and comfort with it. We're seeing rise in telemedicine, which is helping our trials, direct shipment of drugs to patients, which makes it much easier for patients to proceed in trials. So all of it's, I think, coming together. For maybe the silver lining of this is the accelerated technology in a way that might have taken years if we didn't have this challenge in front of us.
So as we're talking about digital interactions, maybe we can toggle to George Goldsmith. As a reminder, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Compass Pathways, fresh off of very successful IPO. So George, congrats on that. And as we're all learning our new digital worlds, one thing I found is that trying to keep continuity and culture of our firm and of our teams a little bit harder to do remotely. Now, I know Compass has been dealing with this challenge even before the pandemic, because you've got a rather small team, but they're not all in one place. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what you can do as a company and what Compass has done to kind of create that sense of culture and unity when we're actually not able to gather together like we otherwise would have.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me be part of today's discussion. It's really interesting. I think in a funny way, we may have an unfair advantage, because in 1994, I actually did the first Harvard Business School CD-ROM, remember those, on virtual teaming in 1994 when I was director of Lotus Institute. So this has been a way of working that we've been quite familiar with for a long time and built Compass. I always felt that it was important whenever we're building teams in the 21st century to focus on work being what you do, not where you are. And so I think for us, we started building the company, finding the talent wherever it is, and then using technology to support us. And so we continue to do that and really build on that foundation. I think what's really, really important in this is to have a strong alignment around mission, a strong sense of it being okay if to share however it's working, the good, the bad, the ugly, to have people be able to be supported in creating whatever work environment they need at home and to provide that support to them quickly. And also to work on the kind of cultural aspects of just because we're virtual and can work anytime doesn't mean we have to work every time. And I've seen that be a real stress, I think, for especially mission-driven teams where it's so easy to connect at all sorts of hours. So I think one of the unexpected pieces was just making sure that people were taking care of themselves and really not only looking at that from having the right equipment, but also taking time. Because there were so little distractions during lockdown. So it created an interesting environment that way for us. But we've been users of technology across the entire business, inside and outside from the beginning.
George, as you're saying that, I could envision the optionality that Compass has brought in terms of geographic flexibility being a competitive advantage for those who may want to take advantage of that. Do you see that changing? Because what we're learning in this pandemic is that we actually, other companies can offer similar flexibility, and if you lose some of that competitive advantage of remote flexibility, how do you continue to maintain some differentiation for your company?
Look, I think it's super important. And for us, being a mental health care company dedicated to transforming the patient experience of mental health, we have our mission, and our mission is really core. And the people who breathe energy into that mission day after day, I think, become an attractant. And so our view is that innovation can never stop and that it's a very big mission. And we seem to be able to attract great talent almost wherever they are. And I think it just makes for really long days because time zones don't change, as everyone on this call knows. So I think there was a little bit of a difficulty in that. But I guess there must be people working on that too.
So we heard a little bit about the services component as being disrupted by COVID. From what we can surmise, psychiatry in particular has changed considerably, and within the world of psychiatry, it would seem that running a trial of a psychedelic drug for depression like psilocybin, despite having what seems to be very, very potent effect, may be particularly challenging this year, and as we're socially distancing as best we can for the time being. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the experience you've had trying to push through that. What are those headwinds you can really change with your own effort, and to what extent you just have to wait this through until we're on the other side?
Well, I think one of the things that's been really clear is that it takes a village to make progress, and that's true at every site. It's true at a globally. I think that we have a trial which is 21 sites in 10 countries that go from the Czech Republic in the east to California in the west. And I think while that was challenging to set up, I think given the pattern of the way COVID migrated, it's enabled us to keep trials going in various parts. And I think we've also been incredibly fortunate in working with regulators who see in many ways a second wave, not of COVID, but of mental health issues. And they've been really, really committed to helping us, whether it's helping procure clear PPE for doing a high-dose psychedelic session with a therapist, so people are comfortable with that interaction when they're possible, to moving all the preparation and follow-up onto a video platform. It's actually worked out really well. We've always integrated technology deeply into training our therapists, the people who support these sessions, and also for the patient journey, helping them prepare. We're just tending to use that more than we anticipated, and the regulators have been incredibly supportive of that. And I think everything we've asked for, whether it's to move face-to-face training to Zoom and develop new types of outcome measures to assess its effectiveness, the FDA has been just right there, really supportive.
I just say one of our macro analysts has been touting the human ingenuity trait during the pandemic, the idea that innovation and ingenuity can overcome most of these pandemic headwinds. It's amazing to see that happening. Maybe we can
we were surprised.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say we were surprised. A couple of weeks ago, we heard from the National Institute of Health Research here in the UK that we were the only trial that actually in mental health, the only commercial trial to continue recruiting through the pandemic. And I think we've really used all of our efforts to be able to pre-screen and do all of those things technologically so that we can maintain momentum to be ready for what's next. So just wanted to add that. Sorry, Josh.
No, that was great. Why don't we hop over to Professor Tom Wilkinson, as a reminder, professor of respiratory medicine and a COVID trial chief investigator. Tom, one thing that's been a theme in biopharma before COVID, but is now more apparent than ever, is we're inundated with innovation now. We've got, I've lost track of the number of different COVID program trials. How is that impacting the field's ability to make progress? Are you worried that we have too many chefs in this kitchen that's impeding progress, or are you more relieved that we have just an endless array of opportunities to explore from the clinical trial lens for COVID?
Sure, that's a fascinating question. I think, if we understand the setting here, this is a sort of emerging disease in which certainly this year, before this year, we knew almost nothing about in terms of the biology of the virus and the clinical course of disease. And so, it would have been a very high-risk strategy to select a limited portfolio of approaches to treat this. As our understanding emerges, we can start to get a feel for where the likely interventions of value are going to be. But, I think this does need a portfolio approach. We need to address many different potential therapeutic avenues in order for one of those hopefully to pay off and to create a step change in outcome, which is still desperately needed. So how do you manage that? And I suppose the downside of that is that everyone does everything and there's very little control of studies entering trials. And although this is a global disease, there are a finite number of patients that can certainly enter earlier phase clinical studies. And so some framework of decision making, I think, is valuable and required. And that has come together quite rapidly. I mean, the UK experience was to have a fairly centralized decision making process and a prioritization approach. So clinical trials, potential candidate therapies went through a prioritization panel, which was nationally curated. And if there was scientific value and potential therapeutic value to an intervention, then that received prioritization and could be delivered through the health research infrastructure in the UK. And what that's done is allow probably the more scientifically valid approaches to therapy to get prioritization. And I think that's been a helpful step forward. The other approach are the platform studies. So studies which run many different assets in parallel and can adopt new therapies quite quickly, sense check their value against a standardized protocol and move on. Those have focused on repurposing initially, so drugs that already have a good safety signal that could be rapidly thrown into this environment and see if they add value. I suppose the downside of that approach is the effect size of those sort of drugs is usually quite small, so you do need lots and lots of patients to get a signal. So I think some structure is required, but not too focused to allow the science, not to pull on all our chips on one horse, but to look across the potential panoply of mechanisms and try and see which of those are likely to be valuable.
Tom, if you had been appointed the global czar of everything drug development for COVID for this year, would you have done anything different to better optimize the way therapeutics are being evaluated?
That's a great question. I think I probably would have put more focus on the early phase development. What we tended to do was go with what's nearest clinic first, and perhaps the more innovative science came slightly behind that. So to try and create a fully accelerated pipeline from preclinical assets all the way through to ones that are at the clinic door already, and to run it all in parallel, perhaps would have been an approach. I mean, everyone's trying to do everything at pace. In hindsight, things have gone, perhaps better than I would have expected. I think to echo the last speaker's point, the regulatory framework and regulators have really stepped up to this. So it's made the whole world work at a different pace, and an expectation of outcome and decision making has really altered enormously. The corollary of that is perhaps there are many different things going through that wouldn't usually get through in the sort of peacetime, as it were. And I also think there are countries which could deliver more in terms of trials capability, that perhaps because they're not driving their own innovation have not necessarily had that opportunity. So a truly internationalized approach that goes beyond the WHO solidarity study to perhaps more innovative assets and ideas could be something we could look forward to if this ever happened again.
And Tom, I'm not sure I could think of a much harder disease indication to study than COVID. You've got imprecise diagnostics, you've got heterogeneous population and a wide range of outcomes, and various disease measures to pick and choose from. Like these feel like some of the hardest trials to run in for therapeutic development. What if any have been kind of the big lessons along the way in terms of having to adapt or change your approach to running these trials, whether it's enrollment, whether it's outcome definition, or stratification or beyond?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's all those things, but at pace, isn't it? So we've had to make sort of a lifetime's experience count in the space of 6 months. I mean, I think that the immediate reflections are that this is a very heterogeneous disease. You can move from asymptomatic, pretty much carriage at one end of the spectrum, to life-threatening, inflammatory-driven disease at the other, and understanding that the patient segmentation, the timing of intervention, the categorization of patients and their comorbidities all has dramatic impacts on how we design our trials and deliver those. So the clinical setting by which we recruit, the patient segmentation needs to come together pretty rapidly if we're going to have successful smaller studies. And I think people are learning that quickly, because we didn't have a validated endpoint, of response, and we knew very little about the natural history of disease. People have jumped straight to pretty relevant clinical pragmatic outcomes like the WHO ordinal scale. And whilst that's a difficult tool to use statistically, actually it's very relevant to the clinical scenario. So if you're preventing a patient going to ITU, if you're preventing longer duration of illness and faster recovery, those are all pretty meaningful statements in the current clinical landscape. And so people have actually almost bypassed bothering to get their biomarker only proof of principle and diving straight into a clinical study which showed potential benefit in a wider setting. And I think that has been a sensible approach. So we're actually, the bar is pretty high for new treatment because they have to show clinical value pretty much straight away. But you have got some very interesting therapies out there now that are achieving that. And obviously the vaccine story is a very positive one. So I think, the community has come together very effectively to deliver so much in a little time.
Why don't we bring in Lyndon and Rachel? We have Lyndon Thompson, Lead Manager, AXA Framlington Biotech Fund, and Rachel Mears, partner at Jado Capital. And I'd started the questions for Tom about, do we have too much innovation when it comes to COVID? That actually, to me, is part of a much broader question of, do we have too much innovation in general, and in biopharma even pre-COVID, and how that might be changing. And Lyndon, we'll start with you. How are you managing through so many programs, so much innovation? Now you've got COVID on top of it, and at what point do you ask yourself whether we just have too much?
Thanks for hosting me today as well. Good question. I think I don't think we can ever have too much, but it certainly makes the investors' lives more difficult. Have I changed my investment strategy at all? No, I don't think so. I mean, I sit in a position where we take, long-term views and can ignore somewhat the kind of volatility in the short term. But certainly, I think, one of the biggest challenges for biopharma companies at the moment is just bandwidth for investors. So many test the waters meetings. One of the aspects of what COVID has done in terms of investment process is, brought a global spotlight onto the sector for all the positive reasons, which is great. But if you look at the number of IPOs we've had this year, it's almost impossible to kind of keep up with all of that on top of all of the other companies that are potential investments there. So the bandwidth problem, I think I've spoken about this on these conference calls before, is I think one of the biggest challenges, trying to get the message out. And from an investor, it's a challenge to try and think about how you prioritize your time, how you prioritize those companies you need to speak to, the ones you would like to speak to. And I think, the hurdle to moving on to the next step, yes, you might want to meet them, but to spend the time to do the work, to do the due diligence, to form a long-term, investment view, I think that hurdle has been raised. So there's a lot of positives, I think, that have come out of the pandemic, as well as the difficulties from an investment point of view. But certainly, I wouldn't like to say there's too much, but it's made life more challenging.
So Lynn, you say no change to your investment strategies. Certainly, some companies' timelines are being delayed by the pandemic. Some companies' operations, particularly those in the neurology or neuropsychiatric settings, are facing some pretty intense what hopefully are transient headwinds. Do you just look past all of this and kind of look at those companies as great opportunities, or are you also having to adjust for the fact that this could still go on for a number of months, and as much as you'd like to look through to the very end of the pandemic, that might be hard to do?
So I think each company is very individual, and I think if you look at the market in general, look at the public markets, a lot of investors have looked through the vast majority of minor upsets and potential delays, and a lot of those high quality companies that have potential some issues from COVID have a share price that's back at the levels pre-COVID, if not higher. Now, there are certainly examples of companies that have found things more challenging. And, as I said earlier, I think being in the position of being able to take a long-term view, you can really take a measured opinion on that. And yes, sometimes they are really good opportunities to buy quality companies on a long-term basis. And so I think it has to be an individual call per stock. But, on the whole, a lot of the companies have already recovered and are already, seeing through those potential slippages.
Rachel, it's been really hard to predict what the world's going to look like in 5 to 10 years, given so much innovation, and that was even before the pandemic. It feels even harder to not just figure out the next 5 to 10 years, but the next 1 year. How are you kind of navigating through all of this, and as you think about earlier stage investments, feeling like you have the confidence of what the 5 to 10 year outlook might be for a company, for its programs, and for even any therapeutic category in particular?
It's a great question. It's lovely to be on the panel with you all, so thank you. And I'll start maybe with that. I think the best tool in the basket right now for venture investors, and I would say the same for entrepreneurs in the early stage of company formation, is that you really need to have diversity of advisors across the ecosystem. So I think, part of what you have to have is something you can literally carry on your back. Because the truth is, I think we could all on this panel have some pretty good guesses in our area of expertise of what the world might look like in 5 to 10 years. But what we're seeing, especially, I think, prompted by COVID, is the potential to have rapid acceleration across many aspects of the ecosystem that will have an impact on companies. And so if we're not talking to teams like this on the panel, and if entrepreneurs aren't picking their heads up from their singular development or their programs or their own innovation thesis, they really could end up having a blind spot. So that would be maybe the first thing, is to know that in some cases you just won't know. And that's one thing. The second thing that's a major focus, I know for us, and I'm sure Lyndon would feel the same way about companies even that are farther along. And I think you're seeing it illustrated by folks who have much more mature companies already, but leadership really matters right now. And so the ability to look 5 or 10 years down the road, we may not have the ability to know exactly what patient access looks like or how digital will come into play with a given therapeutic area or an innovation thesis. But we do know that we want to back entrepreneurs that have the leadership to be going at pace into those kinds of maybe highly evolutionary aspects of what will affect their business. The final thing, to be honest, is in venture, I think there are a lot of different models. And for us as a firm, we have a very solid investment thesis. And it sounds a lot like Lyndon, and it certainly changes with each company in terms of the look that we do. But there are a few fundamentals, and I think those fundamentals are what help you understand 5 to 10 years from now. I think continuity for smaller companies and how you deploy capital is critical to understanding how you're going to deal with an evolved healthcare access. I mean, the truth is, the one commonality I think across the entire panel is that the patient experience is probably fundamentally changed in a number of ways with healthcare going forward. And so if I look 5 to 10 years from now, I'm not exactly sure what it will look like, but I know that whether an entrepreneur or an executive in an operational supply chain or somebody trying to get access into a hospital, that the patient experience is probably fundamentally changed and that those impacts will be accelerated over the next 5 years.
So 2020 is a record year for IPOs, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you might have wondered if the industry would be able to sustain this kind of seemingly new pace of innovation and new company formation. Rachel, from your lens, what is driving this? How are we still so strong at forming new companies with and being able to not only identify good science but good management as well?
On the first part of that question, I think actually George got it right. Innovation doesn't stop. And I think those of us on the call have probably seen cycles in early stage biotech investment over the last 20 years. But one thing that's happened fundamentally before COVID was that there was serious basic infrastructure investment going in to universities, biotech centers, different aspects of the ecosystem, digital, remote access, remote therapeutics. And those things were all seeded a number of years ago. And to some extent, we're basically reaping the harvest of those early aspects of reinvigoration of the entire system. So that's one thing, is that separate from COVID. The second is there's been a worldwide fundamental recognition of the enduring aspect of healthcare needs. And it perhaps seems quite obvious to those of us on this particular panel, but when you go to how investors think about balancing their portfolios beyond a particular venture fund, they look at allocations across different sectors. And we're seeing a real reinvigoration of capital allocation to healthcare, and specifically therapeutics and digital. So I think it's sort of a dual path of what's fueling the innovation. I think the second really fundamental aspect, though, is that not everybody's going to make it. So I think the challenge we have right now is there's incredible innovation coming from really deep scientific centers, albeit biotech hubs or academic labs. But there's also an unusually high appetite for M&A and IPO. I mean, the public markets and quite frankly, companies have hit a double, sort of a double cycle of demand. And right now that's pulling through a lot of things. But I think, for folks like Lyndon, perhaps, and certainly for us, that's where we really have to make sure we're applying investment thesis, because the fundamentals still are going to really matter in terms of how all of these programs go through. But I don't think that the innovation itself will slow down until the markets get a little bit tougher and fundraising becomes a little more difficult.
So if we think about the gating steps, please, yeah.
No, I was just going to add that I completely agree with Rachel's point at the end there. And, my slight concern on a 2021 outlook is that we've got a lot of very early companies in public markets with perhaps proof of concept not for another 12 to 18 months beyond that. And, at the moment, there's enough demand to mop that up. But I suspect as we go into 2021 and whatever Biden has in store, there could be some difficulties with that setup.
So Lyndon, for you and also George, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. It doesn't seem like the science is a gating step. There's plenty of great science, and there's still terrific leadership and know-how to advance the science. It feels to some degree we're starting to see investors as the gating step, just limited bandwidth, limited number of investors who increasingly control the dominant investing dollars when it comes to earlier stage biopharma. Is that something that we can expect as being kind of the main bottleneck for innovation? Are there ways to address it and avoid it? Lyndon, maybe we'll start with you and how you think about that.
So I don't know whether it's the main sticking point, and the last 6 months has shown that a lot of companies can IPO and get to the market. I mean, in the 20 years I've been looking at this sector, I think that this has been the most prolific in terms of number of meetings I've been asked to take, the opportunities there in terms of IPOs. And, speaking for myself, I actually haven't got involved in many of them, just, being able to kind of do the due diligence over it. And, most of them are relatively early stage, if not very early stage. But, I think that from if I was to give advice, it would be just to make sure that you're talking to investors and, the lead investors in biopharma, a couple of years before you're looking to IPO, so that when you come, it's, your story is widely known, you're understood. I think that's probably the best advice to be giving. And then obviously it's just down to the capital markets at the time. And as I said, at the moment, it's fully open. But I've got some concerns about next year.
So George, you were quite fortunate at Compass. Your process generated a substantial amount of interest, and from investors who often don't invest in some of the more traditional biotech IPOs. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your process and ability to raise capital, but also your lens of what might be a little bit more common and what challenges companies might face if they're not bringing something that resonates with more generalist investors, which is kind of, I think, what struck me about Compass most.
Thanks, Josh. I think that one of the things we learned, we don't talk about markets here. We talk about the human experience, and everyone has a story about people they know, close, distant, who really suffer and aren't helped by existing treatments. And I think that story, particularly in the heart of COVID, really resonated, that looking for innovation wherever it's to be found, eliminating this false dichotomy between digital and therapeutics in a traditional sense, really challenging conventional wisdom and really planting our feet into the future and looking back at what's needed today really became critical in working with our investors. And I think also from an investor point of view, having a sense of what the different pools of investment, what different scenarios they're betting on, and to have a balanced portfolio of experimentation, given the rapid experimentation on the company side, it's probably pretty important. One of the things that really strikes me about this time is the real need for an integrative model. What was really interesting, 130 years ago, kind of the dominant technology that was really exciting to everybody was called horseless carriage. It's kind of like digital health. It's these two things, we don't quite know how they'll fit together, but we kind of create this awkward combination like horseless carriage. Well, I think digital health is very similar to that. I think health will be health. I think it'll be delivered digitally. I think trials will depend more on that. I think the integration of these things will be just part and parcel of how we work. And that many of the distinctions we're making right now will look quaint 5-10 years from now. And so I think that the real opportunity here for companies is to plant their feet in the future and work backwards about what they need to do, what they need to deliver. I think this insight that someone had around patient experience, that's really important because it will change. It is changing. And the genie is out of the bottle. It's not going back. So I think that that type of insight and how it plays out in a leadership team is really important, both in the investor community, but also at regulators and also in companies. And from a company perspective, I think the best we can do is something that we did very early and continue to do day in, day out, which is early and often interaction with every single stakeholder. What do they think? How is this going to look? Would this work? So really engaging people rather than viewing regulators as hurdles, payers as problems, needing tough negotiations. So actually, if we're all looking at the problem together, quite often we see new things. And so that kind of early and often engagement with the market to help shape is, I think, really important for everybody, all the players, and however they wish to do it.
So Compass has been a leader in introducing digital health into your drug development paradigm. Maybe you can share some of the things that you've been looking at and advancing.
Sure. I mean, for those who don't know, what we are doing is building on some incredibly brave research, looking at the resurgence of psychedelic medicines, like the active ingredient in magic mushroom, psilocybin, which is what we've synthesized and are taking through with breakthrough therapy designation, the FDA process. And we're obviously need to be very careful stewards of that. So this is a single episodic treatment just once that's given to a patient coming off all other medicines, so it's a monotherapy. And we have people in carefully supported psychotherapy or therapy sessions, not really psychotherapy, but therapy sessions where they're supported with a high dose of psilocybin and a very profound, for many people, psychedelic experience. And that has all sorts of neurophysiological correlates and the ability to essentially have a reset on thought patterns. And that's what we're investigating, just to bring everybody up to speed. So when we look at how do we think about that, well, you have an episodic treatment. The episodic treatment seems to have benefit for many patients, not everyone. So first thing we have to do is figure out who. The thing we have to figure out is, well, what dose produces what duration of experience? So we're working on that. And thirdly, we have to figure out how long is it the duration for whom? And so again, when you have all this variability and your kind of feet firmly planted in 2020, you can look at technology as a way of source of new endpoints. And so from our point of view, yes, biomarkers are important. We're doing that work, but what we're really intrigued about are behavioral markers. These are the markers of using your mobile phone and, does this device, how do I use it? Do I pick it up frequently? Am I calling the same people, not the same people? Is it near other people's devices? What language what kind of words am I using? All sorts of things. It has lots of important patient privacy issues in it, obviously, and working on all that. But suddenly we have the ability to do what our family members have done informally, but using technology. How are you doing today? Are you kind of more connected, less connected? And thinking about these technologies, which don't require anybody to be filling out a form today about how am I doing. It's the digital exhaust of your life. These technologies, something called a whole field called digital phenotyping, I think are becoming really important endpoints. Right now, they're exploratory endpoints, but who knows? The future's nearer than we think.
So maybe we can come back to some of the operational elements and segue off of that question and go a little further. Let's assume that this is all temporary and we are going to be going back to normal. George has talked about some of the changes that are being introduced. Maybe in a digital world now, they're even a little bit easier to gain traction. For Anne and then Hugo, what do you think COVID will change that's beneficial in terms of the way we're operating, introducing new technology or digital therapeutics or digital interactions?
Well, as I said, I think that probably the most dramatic thing we've seen is the response from the physicians out there in the community and their embracing of new ways to interact with patients. So in our case, we actually had one of our largest studies had to lock its database during the middle of COVID. And the response from the physicians on interacting with the patients via telemedicine, allowing us to ship drug directly to the patients, allowing patients to get their labs done at more local sites versus having to travel into the large medical centers where the risk of COVID was higher. All of those, I think, were accelerated by COVID, and I don't think we'll go back. I think Hugo and others said it right. I think we've moved to a new place, and now we need to survive and thrive in this new place, and there's no intention to go back. So I'm excited about what's going to happen in our trials, and we were already on this path. We had many trials which embraced digital interventions, such as Parkinson's trials, where you actually get very objective endpoints by patients interacting with their phone and how they answered questions on their phones. And we're doing that across our trials. Our migraine trials, another one, which the data quality is immensely increased by interacting with their devices versus memory when they go into a physician's office once a month. So I think all of it's accelerated, and our commitment is not to go back. Similarly, I think that our sales model is going to be forever changed coming out of this. Right now, only 20% of oncologists in the US are allowing someone to come into their office to visit them. But at the same time, their response is, we still need the information that you bring us. We still need to know what the new medicines are, how we use them. And we've introduced actually 2 of them ourselves this year and had to do it completely virtually at a time when we had no sales representatives going into offices, but yet we had a new medicine that many physicians had never used before unless they'd been on the trial. So it was remarkable with how quickly they embraced sales interactions via video calls, but also interacting with our websites, which we completely redid to have a different engagement level than we've had in the past, having abstracts and scientific journals and other things linked so that people could go quickly to one site and find the information that we needed. So it's been remarkable. And then if you ask me, probably beyond digitally, what I think has changed out of this, or what we need to retain, most importantly out of this experience, has been the collaboration across the industry. And it's been heartwarming and encouraging for us to see. We've experienced it ourselves with partnerships with Merck KGaA and Amgen to give us capacity so that we could clear out our facilities and just make COVID antibody. We couldn't do that if other companies hadn't stepped up and agreed to make medicines for us. And there's just so many examples and partnerships with the FDA and with the National Institutes of Allergy. Others have just really stepped up to make this happen. And so I hope that we don't go back, because this is a level of collaboration that I've never seen. And I think it's the reason that we're going to get out of this pandemic. And we're going to get out of this pandemic by medicines. And I think we all appreciate that now. And I think the public is appreciating that now, that vaccines and antibodies for those that don't get a vaccine are the way that we're going to get our world back to normal. And that's been achieved through collaboration across our industry. So it's probably one of my proudest moments being part of this sector.
So Anna, it's a very new variable in terms of trying to anticipate. Now this new approach to commercializing drugs, which I'm guessing every company is exploring and evolving at different paces. Is there are there winners and losers in terms of market share gain and market share loss? And how do you think about what it takes to be a winner?
Clearly, I think adaptability is going to be key, and you can see different companies adapting at different rates. And even you can just maybe a surrogate is companies. I think, as someone mentioned, that responded quickly to the COVID crisis, and who did that, and who was able to jump in to help resolve the COVID challenges that we're facing, and who stood back. And so it might be an early surrogate marker for who's got some agility as we move forward. But the fact is that usually these types of innovations are, once successful, are quickly adopted across the industry. So I think you'll see that there will be leaders, but then the whole industry will shift to new ways of interacting with physicians and what platforms we all agree on, and how we interact with them. So I don't see this as a long-term commercial advantage, but a short-term one, yes, as to who responds most quickly. And we already hear from physicians that their appreciation for meeting them where their needs are, not obviously talking to them about things that don't matter at the moment, but how do we talk to them about how to treat cancer patients with COVID, and how our medicines can be supported through this time. That's what they want to know. So I think it will tell in the near term as to who's adaptable. In the long term, it'll probably be a whole shift for the industry that I think it's just a matter of how quickly you embrace it to achieve success. In the end, what matters most to physicians and customers is new and innovative medicines. Who has the best medicines for their patients? That's what we believe will win for all of us in this industry. And so our focus at Lilly is just more medicines that make a difference.
And Hugo, for Sanofi UK, where are you in this evolution? Are you learning every day new ways to engage your customers and incorporate technology that maybe you hadn't thought of before? As you kind of elaborate off of what Anne was talking about, maybe help us see kind of that change on a day-to-day basis over the year.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Anne more. So I'll give you a bit of a concrete taster of what that means for us. So September this year, actually our representatives, our in-field medical staff, and our clinical trials associates in the field in September had more interactions with physicians than they did pre-COVID. But those interactions were very different interactions through what we call starting to call omni-channel in the parlance. But it's because the physician now gets to choose how they interact, and they can choose. And we've given more control to our customers about how they want to interact with us, be it through managing a clinical trial or getting information about our products. So I think that really speaks volumes, and we definitely don't want to get back. So we're building new channels and more interactive channels, and I think that can only add to the relationship. The other thing I build on is the collaboration. When will two of the biggest rivals in vaccines in the world, GSK and Sanofi, get together to co-develop a vaccine? Again, that is fabulous. We're absolutely delighted to be working every day with them to make that happen. But this idea of condensing something that takes 10 years into 18 months is revolutionary. That has to happen again. Why wouldn't it? And it's not, one of our big contests is to tell to the public, this is not about cutting corners on safety and efficacy. It's just never has so much money been available. We have to have a hats off to whichever, let's say, government in the US put BARDA in place, because BARDA has been funding most of this, all except the Pfizer, but also the pre-orders for government. But that means the money meant that 15 things can happen in parallel instead of sequentially one after the other. And that is a fabulous piece of innovation. Let's hope we can apply that in some other. And I think you mentioned it, I think Anne mentioned as well, is regulators. The regulators have innovated themselves. really, really well, be it in terms of looking at potential COVID treatments, looking at clinical trials, looking at vaccines, rolling reviews. It's become the general public knows what a rolling review is now. I would say only people at the heart of the industry knew what that potentially was a few months ago. So that is a fabulous piece of innovation. And then lastly, the last thing I really hope, and we've seen it around both the southern hemisphere and now the northern hemisphere, is the importance of to public health of vaccination. The number of flu vaccines that we've been scraping around for, because every country in the world is phoning us every single day wanting more flu vaccines. So, hey, guess what? It was important this year to keep people out of hospital due to the flu. Well, it'll be important every other year as well, because that's really a public health service. And that kind of dripping, this has accelerated that into the public consciousness. And let's hope that that sticks around well, because it's got to be good for public health.
And on the theme of what's temporary or permanent, we have a question from the audience for Tom, I think. Does the success of the vaccines, and another important update from Moderna on that front this morning, but do the success of vaccines make the therapeutics less relevant? How do you think about the kind of the toggling between the vaccines and the therapeutics now that it looks like we have strong vaccines on the way?
We do indeed. So it is incredibly positive news that we have really a proof of new technology, a new approach with these mRNA vaccines, and very good efficacy emergent data, albeit from preliminary analysis. So what we don't, there are many unknowns, clearly, the duration of effect, the responder population or poor responder population, and also this is a global disease. So how long is it going to take to vaccinate everyone who needs to be vaccinated in a world population? So I think, this unfortunately is not going to go away overnight, even with the best vaccines. And there will always be in any population people that respond less well to vaccines and others better. So there will be a role for therapeutics, in the medium term. I have no doubt about that. And certainly there's an enormous need today for better therapeutics. So I don't think it's a competition. We need to have an ensemble approach to conquering this, of which vaccines will be a fundamental part. If we develop new drugs apace for this pandemic, they may have significant value and indication outside the pandemic. So respiratory viral infections are, a seasonal crisis in most hospitals in the world, and affect how countries run their health services dramatically. Many of the therapies being developed for coronavirus may have indications in that setting, and may actually transform healthcare in the longer term. So I think, there will be some take-homes which are positive from this, that will exist beyond therapy for COVID alone. And in complementarity to the vaccine strategy, these are going to be important, allowing society to open up much sooner than when the last patient globally is vaccinated, which may be sometime down the line. So I think that we need both at the moment.
Patient access has come up a few times during the discussion, and that ultimately is kind of the culmination of a lot of forces at play, which includes having a new government in the United States, perception of the biopharma industry, drug prices, copays, etc. Curious to hear how the group thinks about patient access evolving going forward in 2021 and beyond, whether it's adequate now, whether it needs to improve, and how you think it might ultimately improve. And I'll leave that one open for anyone who wants to jump in, and if not, I'll start calling names. Yeah, Hugo.
Well, I'll start the ball rolling by building on the first thing I said. I think what we're going to see, and we're starting to see in this case, is, like I said, regulators were innovating. So the FDA, the EMA, the MHRA, PMDA. what we're seeing is they're bringing health technology assessments into the room with them as they're doing these rolling assessments. So if we're kind of trying to jump a few steps ahead, what I'd like to see is joint health technology assessments with the regulators with this kind of innovative hat on going forward on rolling reviews. Then at each stage, we would be able to see what data cuts we'd need, what burden of proof we'd need to see in cost effective and generate ICEs and things like that. But as at each step, we could go forward, join hand in hand, regulators. And that would only mean not only through a regulatory pathway would patients get innovation earlier, but through a market access and pricing and reimbursement and uptake, they'd get it earlier as well. So that's me projecting in the future, but we're not that far off. You know, there's another mile to go, but we're not that far off.
Well, I feel compelled to jump in because as one of the co-creators of the European Parallel Scientific Advice process in 2011, we really looked at this whole problem around access, and it was the wellspring for what we're doing at Compass. And I think that this idea of early and often is really important, exactly in what you said. That this is about making sure that we have endpoints that don't have to be argued about later, that actually we're working on it before we pour the huge amounts of funds into our clinical trials, particularly late stage clinical trials. And I think that's so important for everyone to use it. Now, it's easier, ironically, in Europe than it is in the US to do these kinds of discussions involving payers. But I think that it requires that we all look at what are the endpoints very early on. So that's number one. Number two part of patient access is, I think, increasingly we have to really look at, can we sell what people want to buy? And people don't want to buy medicines. They want to buy health. And I think that how we become partners in those outcomes and how we actually get reimbursed and paid for those outcomes rather than the inputs to the system really is something critical. And so I know there's a lot of work in that area. It will come slowly, but I'm sure it will come. Because that's really what health systems look for. It's certainly patients look for. They want to be better. They don't want to be patients anymore. And so however we can work with them to be that and to be a genuine partner in health rather than a vendor to the health system, I think is really important.
I would actually add maybe a quick perspective from very early on, because it might surprise you, but I think thinking about the patient, which I think most innovators do, but really keeping the patient center as you start to form the thesis of what you're going to focus on for indication selection, for how you're going to pursue a path against a target. And quite frankly, one thing that I would be very interested, especially with Anne on the panel, is, we have new modalities that are really challenging for patient access. We have cell therapies that are only available at certain sites. We have gene therapies that are going to be lifelong types of impact, but how do you price that? Because it literally becomes a normalization of health across potential administration. And so I think when we think about the intersection of innovation,
Rachel,
even.
I think Rachel's audio is coming in and out. Let me try to squeeze in one last audience question in the last minute. We have any concerns that ongoing trials will have labs and data points missing that make it more difficult for FDA approval? How do you think regulatory groups will respond to some of the challenges that companies might be going through just by disruption of the pandemic? And maybe we can have you weigh in on that.
Yeah, it's been impressive to see what the physicians and their study coordinators have been able to do. So we haven't had a significant issue in that, not as much as I would have expected. So they're keeping up the quality of the work that we're doing has continued through that, and the quality of the work that our sites are doing. So it hasn't been a huge issue. But even when as I mentioned, we had a huge data lock in the midst of the pandemic, and we did find that the FDA in particular was very reasonable to say, what are the high priority items that we need to know for this? And safety continued to be one of those. But sometimes when we do these, you go to the nth degree of all of the information, and it wasn't, they said that wasn't necessary. Let's focus on what the priorities are. So it was heartwarming to see again that there was prioritization in the time of the pandemic. But in the end, I would say that we've experienced much less of that issue with the trials than I might have thought. They're still finding a way, and it was due to, I think, flexibility on both of our parts. So our willingness to allow patients to get their labs done elsewhere rather than requiring them to go to a certain place. So it required quite a bit of flexibility, but in the end, it was most important that we got those data points, not where we got them, but the fact that we got them and got them in. So I don't think the quality of care suffered greatly. And again, the FDA and other regulators have been so reasonable. And one thing we did do, though, is that we had a number of trials. We did prioritize within Lilly. There were trials that we continued, and there were trials that we actually held because they were not as high priority, and we wanted the physicians to focus on caring for the COVID patients and working on high priority trials. So I think it's just another thing that challenges like this force you to do is really force you to prioritize. And we did that, physicians did that, and hopefully now that we have some open horizon with vaccines and other interventions, we'll see ourselves emerge out of this next year, with new tools in place, but also maybe returning back to some semblance of normalcy.
Excellent. Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. I'd like to thank the participants for a wonderful discussion. And Amber, I think I'll turn it back to you now.
Hi everyone, actually it's Suki from Consilium. Thank you so much, Josh, and all our panelists for such a frank and enlightening discussion. I'm delighted now to introduce our fireside chat between Clive Cookson, science editor of the Financial Times and close friend of Consilium's, and Jan van der Winkel, president and chief executive officer of Genmab. Jan co-founded Genmab back in 1999 and was its president of R&D and chief scientific officer until his appointment as CEO in 2010. So he's been truly instrumental in Genmab's success as a leading global therapeutic antibody developer, and it continues to go from strength to strength. Sadly, we won't be able to see Jan, but we'll be able to hear him loud and clear, and we'll be looking at Clive live in action on our screens. Just a reminder that if you would like to pose any questions to Jan, Clive will keep an eye on the Q&A panel on the left-hand side of the screen. Clive, many thanks, and over to you.
Well, thanks to you, Suki, and all your Consilium colleagues, friends indeed. I'm sorry that Jan is buried in the deep, dark depths of Netherlands, and therefore we can't see him, but he's I hope he's hearing us. Jan, are you there?
Absolutely, and I'm 100% there, Clive, so apologies for all the technical challenges, but I'm going to do it full force from the telephone, old-fashioned telephone.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to talk mainly about current and future events and what the pandemic has done to your business and other businesses. But as Suki said, the Genmab adventure has been a great advertisement for the benefits of long-term investment in biotech and pharma companies. Those 21 years have seen some fantastic ups right from the start, a couple of near-death experiences, and in the last 3 years soaring away with something like a 57% annual EPS growth per year. So before we get to the here and now, this fireside chat is going to start by asking you to encapsulate in 2 or 3 minutes those highs and lows and how you got here, and then we'll sort of pick it up and take it forward, Jan.
Thanks, Clive, and I would be delighted to do that. So we are actually very proud of our 21-year history. We had a few real downs, 2 near-death experiences, I can tell you, which is not unusual for biotech companies, but a lot of ups. And I think the secret behind, the success of the company is its focus. We kept a laser-sharp focus, I think, on the development of differentiated antibody therapeutics for cancer, for treatment of cancer. We continue to innovate, Clive, and actually I'm super proud that we don't have a single unmodified therapeutic antibody in our current pipeline. They're all products from our own next generation antibody technology platforms. And we've done some very good execution. So we did what we promised to the stock market so that the market could really build trust and confidence in the team to execute on our strategy. And I think this focus and then innovation and execution was, I think, the key secret behind the company now, where it is right now one of the leading companies in the antibody therapeutic space. And we certainly learned a lot from the also from the disappointments and the misses in the early days, Clive. But that's not uncommon for flourishing biotechs. I can assure you that Genentech had quite a few lows. Imunex had quite a few lows before they struck gold, and the same holds for many, many other companies like Centocor.
How would you say you were treated by investors on each side of the Atlantic as you went through the lows and then soared back to the highs? And how would you differentiate the attitudes between European and American investors? I think there are quite a few investors on this call.
Yeah, absolutely. Very different. I think in the US, investors react a lot more quickly. So when things go wrong, they really sell out immediately. And you have to work much harder, I think, to really build up confidence and trust again. Then in general, we see with European investors, they tend to be a bit more loyal. So we have been very much helped during the days of the lows, Clive, by our local, and I mean London-based, Scandinavia-based backup investor who really held on. When basically other sides of the investment fields were giving up, when things were not looking that good. But it takes a long time. I can tell you that we had to really work from literally, we had a tough period between 2008 and 2010. We had to work several years before we actually could really convince the market that we were doing the right things. And to me, that's a big surprise. I mean, one of the key victories for Genmab was clearly the creation of daratumumab, now called Darzalex. It's a $3 billion drug, which this year probably becomes a quadruple blockbuster. It's developed by Janssen in partnership with Genmab. And what continues to surprise me is that we are already seen good data with daratumumab in the early days of 2012, end of 2011, early 2012. But then it took Janssen like 2 milliseconds, I think, to figure out that this was an absolute winner and it could become one of the biggest medicines J&J has ever worked on in a 134-year history. And to me, it's a big surprise, Clive, that it took the market 4 or 5 years more because they wanted to see more and more data before they were convinced that this was a real winner. And I think that discrepancy is quite interesting to me to watch. But I think it takes time to build up confidence and trust in the market. We did it very successfully, and now basically it's down to execution and further build the company up to become a leading integrated innovation powerhouse, which is what we're doing right now.
You are indeed. So how well, just to take on that point, how well do analysts, investors, the market, the big companies that are buying and selling your shares and in putting more money into the company when you need it, how well do they really understand it? Why did it take them 4 years to get to know the real potential of this blockbuster?
I think there's again a difference, I think, between European-focused investors and US-based investors. I think in the US they tend to much more strongly focus on the long run, on the potential of the product candidates, and are willing to hang in for a long time after they build up confidence in the company. And I think in Europe there tends to be a much more short-sighted type of view, more momentum type players, and I speak in general. There's of course exceptions. We also have some very large investors in Scotland and in Edinburgh who really built positions very early on and held on for a very long time in the company. But I think in general there tends to be a much more short-term focus in Europe and actually only willing to give biotech companies more credit for products which are really already close to the market or just on the market. Whereas in the US, I think there's much more focus on the potential. And right now we see a shift with the US IPO last year in July last year, Clive, of building up a bigger and bigger and broader US shareholder base, because now track record begins to really kick in. Genmab is one of those companies where we actually tried 38 new molecules in the clinic in the 21 years that we exist. And today, 23 of them are in full-blown clinical development. 3 of them are already breakthrough therapy drugs on the market, all candidates, multi-blockbusters right now. And this hit rate of over 60% of all the molecules ever brought into the clinic, Clive, and then still in full-blown clinical development is unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. And I think that advantage, that realization, is actually working much more effectively right now in the US market than in the European market, because I think there is a common belief there that track record really does say something about the potential for the future. So I think we're in pretty good hands, having a very diversified shareholder base, both in Europe and in the US, and also increasingly in Asia at this point, because the company is profitable since 2013. In Asia, profitability is a key team, an important team, and that is of course not so common for biotech companies. But Genmab is one of the few real profitable companies, and we are increasingly profitable based on royalty income from our products in the coming years, we anticipate.
So it's very hard for someone like me who doesn't follow your industry full time to look at a pipeline and see endless mabs, tetraplamab. Can you tell us which ones out of the 23 that are in development we should be particularly looking out for? I mean
there's a number
how can people who are sort of perhaps on the fringes of the industry, like me, but interested, how can we possibly sort of learn which is really important and which we can just park in our consciousness or in our memory?
I can tell you, Clive, the biggest part of our valuation, of our value, is currently driven by Darzalex or daratumumab, which is an antibody for treatment of multiple myeloma. That's the 3rd most common blood cancer. And,
Yes.
And thanks to the introduction of daratumumab, you can relate to that. We have, for the first time in history, being able to really get very, very long treatment durations. This is a medicine which works very well together with other types of medicine. And we're really seeing a big change here in these patient populations over all the lines of treatment. We're developing that molecule together with Janssen, which is part of J&J, the biggest healthcare company on earth. We now have 140 clinical trials, more than 20 phase 3 trials. We are on the market in the US in 8 different indications, so very broad use. And what we see is that molecule is really giving very long-lasting, very, very effective treatment of that type of cancer, so that patients can actually live longer and longer with their disease being under control. I mean, in the future, we hope to see a future for those poor patients, that they can actually live with their cancer until they die of becoming old or for another reason, and that they actually die with their cancer rather than from their cancer. So we literally are turning that disease into a chronic indication, which is a absolute breakthrough. And then we have several other antibodies. I'm not going to go through the complete list here, but one of the new molecules which gets a lot of attention is epcoritamab, and I apologize for the complex names. And then the good thing is, Clive, you cannot blame me, but you have to blame the World Health Organization, because they are dreaming up these funny names. But for experts, it's very clear what type of antibody that is. And this is a so-called bispecific antibody. It can actually bind 2 different targets, a cell of the immune system, as well as a tumor target. And this molecule is unbelievably effective in early stage clinical testing in treatment of different blood cancers, different cancers than daratumumab. We have partnered this molecule in June this year with AbbVie, and this is a 50-50 partnership. And that is also, I think, a nice one to illustrate that. I mean, in the years around 2012, we were not able to force a company like Janssen into a 50-50 partnership, but now we can, because of our strong cash position and our robust presence in the market, we can actually say to a partner, well, let's develop it together, and then we want to commercialize it together with you in big territories like the United States. And even more so, we want to actually book the sales, which in the old days, Clive, you would never been able to negotiate out of a pharma company. So the power balance is shifting, I think, with the very, very successful biotech companies of this era. And you see the same with BioNTech and Pfizer and with some other alliances which are very important. I just heard the panel in the COVID-19 era. So I think biotech is getting more and more seen as the true innovator, creating most of the new medicines or candidate medicines in pharma. And Genmab is clearly one of those names. And together with AbbVie, we're going to hopefully bring epcoritamab to the market and then fundamentally change the treatment of B-cell cancers, which is a very large group of lymphomas and leukemias in humans. So we are super excited about that. And when you want me to go on, Clive, I can go on for another 45 minutes, but that may become
No,
a
you've
bit of
given
a
us a
monologue.
nice flavour, Jan. Thank you very much. Now, for the first time bringing COVID into the discussion, you mentioned BioNTech just now. Were you at all tempted to bring Genmab into the fight against COVID and SARS-CoV-2, given your great expertise in antibodies? Could you have joined the battle against the pandemic? Or maybe you have and I've just missed it.
No, it's a very good question. And now we always want to stay very focused on cancer, because I think it's very important to keep focused on one area where you can really understand the disease really, really well and have a track record, Clive. But I can tell you that some of our next generation technologies, so new supercharged antibody therapeutics, which will build the medicines of the future, that knowledge we are sharing at this moment with two companies who are developing antibody therapeutics for COVID-19 disease. And so we are giving actually for free access to those new technologies to really help the world, because we need therapeutics. It was already discussed in the panel, not only vaccines, and luckily a number of them look very good, but also therapeutics. And what was not discussed in the panel, we also need increasing access to rapid tests to really do coronavirus screening, because that is the next stage, Clive, in society to being able to open up, is by the ability of doing massive, very rapid testing. And I can tell you that some of Genmab's robotization and computerization experts are working with the Dutch healthcare authorities to really set up very, very large robotic testing to allow society to actually do much more quick testing of very large numbers of people, because that is the component which we really need before we can all be vaccinated in the future, so that we can get our lives back, Clive, and then open up societies and also open up companies in an effective way. And so Genmab is participating in those areas. And the last thing I want to say is that one of the antibodies we developed for Bristol Myers Squibb is right now being tested in cancer patients which have double bad luck, because they also have coronavirus disease, to see whether they can actually deal better with that coronavirus infection, Clive, with this antibody. And this is an antibody against IL-8, which is an inflammatory mediator. And we know that IL-8 is playing a role in the inflammation caused by the coronavirus. So in an indirect way, we are very involved in helping the world, I think, to deal better with the coronavirus pandemic. But our product focus continues to be on cancer. And that is, I think, the thing we need to do. What I already said, in the focus on innovative antibodies for cancer is clearly our field of expertise.
I wanted to go back to something you said a moment ago. You were talking about new supercharged antibodies and that you were sharing them with a couple of companies. Can you say a bit more about that? How are they supercharged? And can you say which those companies are?
Absolutely. So this was in the context of coronavirus disease, and I can tell you that one of the platforms to make these new types of antibodies, with a normal antibody you can hit one target. With these new molecules you can hit two targets. And that can also include cells of the immune system which normally are not involved in antibody therapy, Clive. And in that way, you can make cancer therapy a lot more effective. And for example, we have actually partnered that technology with Janssen, and they have 3 of these bispecifics which do great. One of them is for lung cancer, hitting 2 different disease targets, and then there are 2 more for multiple myeloma, the same disease as where daratumumab works. And all 3 have already been flagged up by Janssen to become potential game changers, which can potentially become blockbusters in those cancer therapeutic fields. And the first one, amivantamab, already got a breakthrough therapy designation. So it's a way to make antibodies simply a lot better. And then the second technology is a way to make antibodies like 100-fold better in killing targets than a normal antibody can, while still hitting the same targets. And that is a technology called hexabody technology, for which we actually have 2 molecules in the clinic, testing them out in patients. And the third one, which will very soon move to the clinic, which we filed an IND for in the last month. And that is a way to make these antibodies kill normal cells a lot better, or target cells, than regular antibodies can. And what we did is, Clive, we looked at how in your and my body, how nature actually makes antibodies more effective. And while we studied that, we understood how we can make basically most types of antibodies better without attaching chemotherapy or other more primitive technologies, using more primitive technologies. And this is just in the testing stage. And both of these technology platforms, the bispecific platform and the supercharged platform, are being used now by smaller companies making anti-coronavirus antibodies to see whether we can also make those antibody therapeutic approaches more effective. And we need, as we heard on the panel, we really need antibody therapeutics and other medicines to treat coronavirus disease patients better until we are at the stage that we can all be vaccinated and then hopefully be protected more effectively from this virus. So there is a lot of activities ongoing. Where you want me to give another example, we have a bispecific antibody technology we made available for Novo Nordisk for hemophilia, for a blood clotting disease. And that allowed Novo Nordisk to make 30,000 candidates, therapeutic candidates. The molecule is called MIM8. And only one of the 30,000 is actually better than a leading Roche antibody therapeutic, Hemlibra, for hemophilia. And this antibody just went into phase 2 by Novo Nordisk. And that's yet another example how we can actually innovate antibodies, Clive, and then actually make that technology available to other companies so that they can make better therapeutics. So our impact on the lives of patients will get bigger and bigger in the future. Also, when Genmab is not itself developing those molecules, but that's actually being behind the technology used by other companies to really develop better therapeutics. So I can tell you that these novel technologies will be behind 60% of the growth of the antibody therapeutic space. And this is already a massive area, over $100 billion income every year, more than 90 FDA-approved therapeutic antibodies. And this is going to grow, set to grow over the coming years. So this is going to be massively important for all of us.
One thing that was mentioned during that panel discussion, the excellent discussion that we both listened to, I think it was by Anne White in particular, was that the pandemic had increased the amount of collaboration within the industry. Can you tell us whether you've noticed that, and if so, how it's affected Genmab?
Absolutely, and I already gave you one example with the robotization experts, which helped some government institutes in the Netherlands and also the Dutch equivalent of the NIH to really develop more rapid testing for coronavirus. But I can see it at all levels. I mean, the clear examples, of course, Oxford University with AstraZeneca, BioNTech, a German biotech company with Pfizer. What we have seen is a massive collaboration and interaction between academic groups, biotech companies, pharma companies to together crack this immense problem of this new virus, which we need to bring under control in order to open up our societies and help patients basically with this coronavirus disease. And I can tell you that this actually is a much broader phenomenon. I believe that this is there to stay, Clive. I think we are moving into a new area where we see more and more networking and interaction between companies, not only academics, biotech and pharma, but also data sciences companies, medical electronics companies, potentially logistics companies in the future. Because I think we need to bring different players together to together work at these interfaces between different fields and actually make new medicines available to society much more quickly. So this acceleration, which we have seen with the coronavirus vaccines, that you can actually develop in less than 8 months a vaccine, which in the old days, Clive, took us like 10 years to develop. I think we see that acceleration also in other fields like cancer therapeutics in the future. So that is one of the really positive things, I think, coming out of the coronavirus era. And then, of course, on top of that, the fact that we now know that you can actually do deals and sign partnership agreements by just having access to Teams and Zoom and Blue Jeans and other video connections is also a realization that you don't have to fly every week 3 times, which was for me, people like me, very common to fly to at least 2 different places every week. I think that is not good for the environment on the long run. So I think that this will change the way we run our lives forever, I think, from here on. And hopefully this collaboration and joining forces is also something which will then lead to a better perception of our industry as really an industry which is there to help us all live better, higher quality lives in the future and get new medicines for diseases where we really need it. So I think this coronavirus era is definitely a challenge. And also has really hit us all. I think at this point also personally, but also had a lot of good, probably lasting new models which are there to stay, Clive. I firmly believe that.
Well, there's a lot to pick up on there. How well do you think the industry has portrayed itself in the past and now? How do you think this really is improving the image of the industry? How well do you think it's been pharma, biotech, biosciences have been portrayed, well, by people like me in the media in the past and now? Do you see things getting better?
I hope that things get better. I think there's early indications that things look better now. But I think what we need to do as an industry, Clive, is be much more communicative, much more open in communication with society. I think we also need to be willing to actually be creative and develop new medicines in shorter periods of time. One of the ways Genmab is doing that is by very actively investing in data sciences, because when we get access to more data, Clive, we can actually work on better targets. We can do more rapid clinical development because we don't have to use placebo-controlled trials, which we now need to do in order to get our medicines towards the market. But we can potentially give to the regulators data sets which are collected in very, very stringent and orchestrated manners. So we can actually do smaller trials, do drug development more rapidly, and then also target them much more effectively to the hospitals and to the distribution centers than has been done up to now. We are now really looking at this whole array to actually bring medicine faster to patients, and that should lead to lower prices, Clive, and so that we can actually really impact the lives of more and more patients in a more effective manner, and that will lead to a much more positive perception of the industry. I'm very, very sure. But I think there's lots of steps where we need to improve on. But I think it's crises like these which will really, I think, in the end, sort out the winners. I think which will really take the initiative and move at the forefront. And I think that we are already beginning to see a more positive perception of pharma companies. I think biotech were always in a bit different range than pharma companies, but I think we need to work together. In the end, we all need to, I think, join forces to bring new medicines to patients at lower prices in more effective manners, and also in much more interaction with society. So I think we have to open up, and I think we have to change our way of communication.
I was going to ask you next about the regulators and how they're innovating, because you mentioned feeding more data in a different way to the regulators. How have you found that they've responded during 2020 to the new circumstances?
I think they have done an amazing, amazingly good job, I think, in looking at new candidate vaccines, I think, for coronavirus. That is, of course, not our own business, but what I can tell you is that when you only look at how many data sciences experts the FDA have been hiring recently, you can see this trend. So I think the regulators are very much moving towards helping and interacting with companies to really bring medicine sooner to patients' lives. So I have been very positive in the proactive way regulators have looked at new medicines. Of course, we have several medicines which are now enrolling reviews. One of the daratumumab new indications in amyloidosis is under RTOR review, which is a very rapid review by the US FDA. It's also being reviewed under Orbis, which is a new project with where Canada and Singapore and the US and several other regulators are working together to speed up actually the processes via which new medicines can be approved. So I think the regulators have done fantastic in actually thinking with companies how to actually bring really much needed new medicines more rapidly to patients. So I think also in the coronavirus vaccine area, we will see some very rapid approvals for emergency use by the regulators. So I think I've been very, very positively impressed by how rapidly they're changing their tone towards focusing on bringing safe, effective medicines towards patients quicker than in the past.
It looks as though we're going to have a Biden administration for the next 4 years in the US. How do you expect that to affect your business and the industry more generally?
Oh, I mean, honestly, we will work with any administration, Clive. It would not be appropriate, I think, for me to really comment on the US process, but I can tell you that no matter who occupies the White House, we don't let that impact the important work we do to transform the future of cancer treatment. And we stay very focused on our vision, and we will work with any administration, including the Biden administration, if that would hold true. And I think what we will do is keeping focused on creating differentiated new medicines which can really make a substantial impact on the lives of cancer patients. And I think that those medicines will be needed no matter which administration is overseeing the country at that time.
And what about the pressure to reduce prices? You mentioned that you might be able to cut prices through greater efficiency. Whoever the new administration is, that pressure is going to increase next year, isn't it? In the US in particular.
I think that pressure is going to change for sure, but I can tell you that I think the whole industry will be impacted, I think, by that impact, and I think that's probably also understandable, Clive. But what I can tell you is that the most innovative medicines are the ones which will be the least impacted, I think, which will have the easiest discussion with regulators and with society for reimbursement. And all of our medicines are like truly differentiated, innovative therapeutics. So we will be impacted for sure, but we will be impacted less hard than other companies will be impacted by. So we look with confidence to the future. And my definition of success is, Clive, is how many patients we can actually help with our medicines. And I want that number to be as high as possible. And I think one of the factors in limiting that number of patients could be the pricing of our medicine. So I hope that we can, with society, define a reasonable price level so that we can actually help as many patients as possible. That would make it all worthwhile.
Cancer has had the lion's share of pharma R&D 36 or 40%, depending on how you count it, in recent years. And companies like yours have used that to produce a wonderful array of new drugs. But people working in other areas, mental health, psychiatry, infectious diseases, obviously highlighted by COVID, antimicrobial resistance, some of them will say that too much of the resources are going into cancer, public and private. Do you have any sympathy with that view? And do you expect the limelight, the financial focus to shift away from cancer?
No, I think cancer is an important disease. 1 out of 3, and perhaps even 1 out of 2 people in the future will be hit by cancer. So we need new medicines, Clive. What I can tell you is that there has been a very strong focus on cancer therapeutic antibodies. This is one of the fastest growing areas in the whole pharma industry. And I think some other disease areas like infectious diseases have probably been received too little attention. I think that has now changed with the pandemic we are all suffering from. And other disease areas have been with a little bit too little focus from the industry, because it has shown to be so difficult to develop new medicines. And then CNS diseases is one of those areas where actually the modeling in the laboratories are much less predictive for what you will actually see in human patients. So it has been much more challenging to develop in a consistent and effective way new therapeutics. But also there we see now some real good advances and next steps. One example is Kesimpta by Novartis. It's one of our own antibody therapeutics originally developed for cancer, which Novartis has now developed for relapsing MS, Clive, and is a fantastic candidate medicine which has been filed in the US and hopefully will get to the market. It has been introduced on the market in the US and hopefully will get on the market in Europe for relapsing multiple sclerosis, and with sensational data. So sometimes medicines originally developed for one disease area are working much better in another disease area. We have another fantastic example with Tepezza, one of our other medicines. This was originally developed with Roche for cancer, Clive. It didn't really work effectively in cancer, but then it is repositioned by Horizon Therapeutics for treatment of Graves' eye disease or thyroid eye disease, and it's now one of the fastest launching medicines ever, and the very first medicine ever for Graves' eye disease. So I think these other disease areas deserve to be getting more attention, and I think we will see that in the coming time while we are understanding better and better how antibody therapeutics actually work and actually work most effectively. So I think we see that balance shift in the coming years.
Thank you, Jan. And my last question, which you have a couple of minutes to answer, is where do you see GenMab in 5 or 10 years? What sort of drugs will you be developing, introducing? What will be the sort of your corporate position then? We started looking back and we're ending looking forward.
Exactly, and that's the way we should do it, of course. What we are going to be in 5 years is one of the leading companies as an integrated innovation powerhouse. So we will have commercial arms. We are currently focusing on building up commercial teams in the US and in Japan, which are the anticipated largest and second largest markets for some of our medicines, which we hope to bring to the market in the coming years. We expect at least two market launches where we will actually commercialize our medicines together with key partners, one with Seattle Genetics for cervical cancer, and then hopefully with AbbVie for epcoritamab in blood cancers. And we hope to actually have some late stage clinical development in place, Clive, to make this a integrated, fully fledged commercial biotech company, so we can actually bring our medicines even more effectively towards patients and make the impact on patients even bigger than we could do up to now via commercialization partners. And we are also innovative, Clive, at commercialization. We want to be as innovative there as we are at the R&D front, where we clearly are now one of the leading companies. So we will hope to actually innovate also that last stretch to actually make the impact of our life work even bigger on many more cancer patients. So I think that we look at a very bright future for Genmab.
Well, thank you, Jan. Looking at what you've done over the past 20 years, I believe that you will succeed in doing that. So many thanks for answering my questions in such a lively and entertaining and intelligent way. I really enjoyed every moment of that, apart from the 3-minute technical glitch, which lost me. So finally, I'm going to hand back to Suki to close the conference. So thanks again, Jan.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you all for listening into this, and stay safe and keep optimistic.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Clive. Thank you. And Jan, I know you're very busy and we're really grateful that you were able to join us and your candor today. Thank you. This brings us to the end of today's programme. Thanks to our moderator, Josh, and all our fantastic panelists earlier who took time out of their busy schedules, not just today, but in the lead up to the event. My take-home message, I think, from the panel discussion is that innovation will never stop. Timelines have been accelerated through incredible will and virtually unlimited funding. Collaboration across the industry has been a real highlight in tackling this pandemic, and the perception of the pharma industry has been changed forever. A big thank you to all of you from all over the world for joining. We had almost 400 register for today's event, which is amazing. We're so grateful to our sponsors, as always, for their amazing support. Citi Depository Receipt Services, Cooley and Stifel, and also to Intrado. It's been heartbreaking to not see our clients, friends, fellow advisors and colleagues in person since March. And we hope, particularly with all the vaccine updates streaming through over the past week, to see you all safely in 2021. That's all from us today. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe. Bye.